All right. Congratulations, you've made it to closing day. So here's some things to get you ready for a smooth transition from closing day, also to prepare you for the expectations of closing day and beyond. I get a lot of questions at this point, and I'm going to address them in this video for you. And we're going to start with scheduling your utilities. Okay, so we want to do that before closing day, because what we don't want is you to close on your house, get the keys, go to your home and you have no utilities. Okay, so we got to plan that. And so ideally your agent is going to contact the selling agent, and we're going to say, hey, what day are y'all going to have the utilities turned off? We'll have them turned on. Also, we want a list of the companies that they're using so it's a smoother transition. If not, you pick your own companies. It's fine if there's options to pick from. But ideally, utilities will transfer or change over oftentimes the day before closing or on closing day. Now, we want to schedule that in advance, a few days at least, possibly a week. But we have to be able to be flexible, because like we talked about in the video on after appraisals, now what? Anything could happen. They could keep your closing from happening on that day. So we've got to be flexible and be able to adjust those utility turnovers and adjust those utility changes from the seller to the buyer. But we want to have that scheduled. We also want to do a walkthrough at least 2 to 3 days before closing day of the home. We want to make sure that that home is in the condition that you agreed to purchase it in, meaning nothing crazy's happened to it. There's been no fires, there's not been a flood, there's not been like a wall knocked down or whatever craziness could go on. But even little things like, let's say there was a Nest thermostat. People love these things. And let's say the seller took it. Okay, well, they're not supposed to. Okay, because by the design of the contract, if it requires tools to remove from the house, it is considered part of the house, and that would be an item that oftentimes the seller doesn't think about. Well, I shouldn't take this, but they do. So we want to go through there and make sure that those items are there. If not, we got to go back to the listing agent and say, hey, look, these items are missing, or this item is missing. Let's reconcile this. Let's get this taken care of before closing. So those are things that we're looking for. We definitely want to schedule the closing time with the title company. Okay, different title companies have other options available depending on what's going on. They'll meet you where you are, depending on your location. They'll bring the paperwork to you and go through it with you, so you can sign remotely, not at the title company. Some title companies, I mean, you can actually meet there, and they have a signing room where you can just do everything. They kind of give you a rundown of each document and explain to you what each one is. So title companies can give you options for closing. They can have you do it at the title company, and we need to talk to the title company to make sure what the options are. But you can close at the title company. They can meet you. I personally did a closing in a parking lot outside my work for my own house. I've had other people where the title company sent a courier out and notary to have them sign at their workplace. And maybe the buyer or the seller are out of town, and so the title company has to overnight documents to be signed, and there needs to be a notary involved. But depending on what the situation is, it might take a little bit more scheduling and planning to get those documents signed before closing day, before that scheduled closing day. So that's something to think about, depending on what your situation is. If you can either commute to do it, have them commute to you, or if we need to do some overnighting of documents, we just got to be able to anticipate all that. So we want to talk to title as pretty quickly as we can when we know that we're moving towards closing. Okay, things that you should take to closing. Your lending company is going to tell you how much your check for closing costs are going to be. They've got to get the information to the title company, so the title company is also going to have that number. But ultimately, you need to wait to get that number, and then that is the check that you need to have made out. So you'll have that money in the bank You have to get a certified check for maybe it's a couple thousand to several thousands of dollars, or even hundreds of thousands depending on your situation, and that check was brought to title, and that's what's used as a portion of getting everything closed. I also recommend bringing a checkbook, because rarely but occasionally smaller numbers might be missed or adjusted right at the very end, so you just want to have the ability to kind of handle that right there at the closing table. Bring your form of ID for sure. Texas driver's license or passport can work, and a social security card is a good idea to have that as well, just as a double form of identification. Don't forget it. I have definitely shown up to closings where someone has forgotten that ID, and we just have to wait for them to go back and get it, and it can certainly slow things down. And people that close the title, people that close the deals, I mean, they've got things scheduled throughout the day, so it might be something where we would even have to reschedule to another day if we forget those items. So make sure you've got that ready to go. Here's the big question that I get a lot, and that is, when do I get the keys? This is a huge question, and I want to make sure that I address this so that you are prepared for how this works. You don't get the keys typically, because when we put it into the contract, it says possession will happen after closing and funding, or at closing and funding. Well, closing is when everybody signs, okay? Sellers, buyers, everybody. Funding is when the lending company pays off the loan of the sellers and then puts the loan in your name. Okay, I've seen that happen where the buyer signs first, so the lending company's kind of already got everything ready to go, and as soon as the seller signs, it's pretty darn quick. So I've seen it happen within an hour or a couple hours of closing, but I've also seen it take some time. I've seen it where maybe if they scheduled on a weekday late on a after bank hours are closed, maybe they do a 5 o'clock closing on a Thursday, maybe the funding doesn't happen till Friday. I've seen it happen on a late Friday afternoon, and then the funding didn't happen till Monday. So you wouldn't get the keys until you get funding, okay? So that's something to think about. So my caution to you is this: don't go and get all your movers ready and everything like that, get the van packed up, and you think that as soon as you sign the documents at the title company, you're gonna move in that afternoon. It doesn't work that way, and I want you to be careful about that. I always say, give 24 hours, at least 24-hour cushion, more if you can handle it, but at least a 24-hour cushion for an occupied home. That's a seller occupied home, to make sure they've got their stuff out after closing, okay, and that you're not trying to move stuff in while they're trying to move stuff out. So I want to give you an example of trying to get into a home before you actually fund it, meaning take full possession. And so this is a true story about a person that I had represented. I was representing them as the seller of the home that this story happened to when they bought this house, okay? So this is their story, and it's a great example of why you should be very careful about trying to get possession or get the keys too soon, and why we as agents guard those keys until we know that that deal is executed, it is funded, everybody's signed, and it's now the buyer's property, okay? So here's the story. The seller, when they went to buy their house that I was helping them sell, they had to buy the house on a contingency, meaning they had to sell a house in order to buy this house. That was great. Well, they did everything they were supposed to on getting their house sold. They did everything they were supposed to on buying this house. They closed, right? They signed on the sale of their house, which then meant they could go and sign on the close or the purchase of their next house. They took the keys and they went to work. Now, this house was vacant that they bought. The seller hadn't been there for quite some time, so they knew they could just go in. They went to work. This house needed some love, and they just went to work, taking stuff out, painting, redoing stuff. I mean, put some time and effort into this thing. And a few days later, they got a call that says, hey, you don't actually have ownership of that house. You need to stop what you're doing. And the reason why was because their house that they had sold, that buyer's funding fell through. which meant that their deal fell through, which meant that they didn't have funding for the house they bought, which means they weren't actually in possession of it, and they were in there putting several $1000s worth of work and time into this house that they did not actually own on paper. That's crazy. But that happens. It used to happen a lot more before the industry kind of figured this is an issue and learned how to have this conversation with buyers and say, just hold off. It's better for everybody. It's better, especially better for you, that you move all your stuff in and find out for some crazy reason the house is not actually yours. What a pain in the butt that would be, right? And so that's an example. A lot more to that story. That's a very condensed version of what might happen to cause a hiccup in the transferring of the property from the seller to you, and you go in there thinking it's yours, and all of a sudden you find out it's not. Now I can tell you, obviously that worked out. They did take possession of it, but they had to make sure that the buyer's funding on the house they were selling went through. So it took a lot more time than they anticipated, maybe a week or two, to get everything rounded out and finished up, and then they could go back and finish the work they had started. So, but yeah, I mean, that's an example, and I just want you to understand that, yes, we want the keys. We've gone through this process. We've been so patient, and by golly, we want those keys. We want to get in that house, and we want to live there. Well, we just want to be patient and make sure that it is closed and funded, and what the importance of all that is. Now, thanks so much for sticking around to the end of the video. And remember, if there's anything in the world I can do for you, just be sure to reach me. You can always leave a comment below or hit me up with the email or phone number listed in the description below. And be sure to like and subscribe, and that way you'll be notified when other videos come out in the future.